I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Kabria Baumgartner, and she is going to be speaking on good old election week in Black Civic Culture in Essex County, Massachusetts, from the years 1741 to 1831. As noted here, Negro Election Day was a prominent Black cultural festival that took place in late May during election week in towns throughout Essex County, from Salem to Marblehead. Her talk uncovers the history and legacy of Negro Election Day, focusing on Black women and children who, through storytelling, memory making, and joy, created an early Black civic culture. I'm super excited to hear this talk as we particularly ponder here in the 21st century the challenges and a pushback towards the plight of Black folks having a vote at the hands of white supremacy. My friend, welcome.
Thank you for that introduction. Can you all hear me? No, a little closer? Okay. Okay. Good. So good morning. I'm delighted to join you at this symposium. I'd like to thank the organizers who've devoted so much of their time and energy to plan this symposium, and to the sponsors. This was much discussed, I think, about a year and a half ago, and of course the pandemic threw a wrench in our plans, but I'm glad that we're all here today. It's also a pleasure to speak after Professor Manisha Sinha's wonderful keynote, but it's also a tough act to follow. Professor Sinha was my graduate advisor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. In fact, it was after taking one of her graduate seminars on early African American history that I decided to shift my focus away from 20th century African American literature toward 19th century African American history. So I owe a lot to her, and I'm very grateful and really appreciate her brilliant scholarship, which you heard today. My research interests are in 19th century African American history, focusing on African American women and children, as well as the history of U.S. education. My first book, In Pursuit of Knowledge, tells the story of African American girls and women who fought for their educational rights in the 19th century Northeast. A recent project has pulled me back to the 18th century Black history, and that has been a lot of fun. I've been working with staff at 2 National Park Service units here in Essex County, Salem Maritime and Saugus Iron Works. Dr. Emily Murphy, who's the wonderful historian and curator at both of those parks, wrote a grant a couple years ago to fund the research and writing for an annotated resource guide on the history of African Americans in Essex County. And so the work that I've done the last couple of years, sort of tracing this history, builds on the work that's already been going on at the park. She and others have long known that there really is a deep and rich Black history in the area. But much of it is scattered, misplaced, or buried. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to Nina Dayton's talk a couple of weeks ago. She found some documents related to Phyllis Wheatley Peters, and her husband, John Peters, who were living in Middleton. So those are, Essex County. So those are the kinds of finds that we're coming across as we dig into this history. So over the last 2 years, I, along with my co-principal investigator, Dr. Elizabeth Duclos-Orsello, who teaches at Salem State University, along with a team of undergraduate and graduate students, have visited over 20 repositories here in Essex County. And we've been gathering materials and documents. It's really been a lot of fun. You don't often have the luxury of just going into a repository and seeing what's there. Often as historians and scholars, we go with a mission, right? We have something in mind, but it was really nice to go in there to these repositories and just see what was there. Lots of different themes emerged from the records that we explored. There's quite a bit about Black women's lives, and I've given a talk about that for the Salem Maritime. Black entrepreneurship. I was surprised to see that as a theme. I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised to see it as a theme in the 19th and 20th century. The work of Black writers. There was a community of writers here in Essex County, and then, of course, Black cultural festivals. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to thank the archivists and librarians and independent scholars in the area who have greatly influenced this resource guide, who shared with me many sources. And of course, this was during a pandemic, so they were kind enough to digitize materials when we couldn't actually visit on site. So I'm very thankful to them. So today I'll be talking about some of those records and materials that I've uncovered related to Black Election Day. One thing we noticed in our research is that much of the archival record in this region concerns the slave trade and slavery, right? And that's not a surprise because there's a very sordid and difficult history, right, of slavery in this region. The earliest known record of the arrival of enslaved Africans to New England was in 1638 on the ship Desire, which arrived in Salem. A lack of records makes it nearly impossible to know the exact number of enslaved Africans forcibly brought to Massachusetts during the colonial period. So some scholars have estimated that there are around 10,000 enslaved Africans who were brought to New England between 1638 and 1770, and then perhaps upwards of 4,000 or 5,000 who came from the Caribbean. There are, of course, census records from the 1750s and 1760s, but many scholars believe that those census records are an undercount. So we don't have exact population numbers, right, when we're thinking about Africans in New England and Africans in Massachusetts. An important point that I want to make here is that there was ethnic diversity among enslaved Africans in Massachusetts. And there were these sort of, ethnic, geographic, and linguistic differences among them. So when we often talk about enslaved Africans as a monolith, that's inaccurate, right, in a lot of ways. I think what it shows us is that there's this terrible tragedy, right, of European colonization and conquest. So when we say enslaved Africans, that's a result of a process, right, a process of dehumanization, oppression, forced migration, and enslavement. So we have this incomplete data about the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in Massachusetts, which really sets the context for our understanding about enslaved and free Africans in New England. But again, another point I want to make here is there's so much more to it. As teacher Jania Hoover argues, quote, "The typical American history course discusses Black people this way. They were enslaved, Lincoln freed them, some bad people took away their rights, Martin had a dream, and Black people got their rights, yay, no more racism." Most Black history, if taught at all, is a chronology of pain and suffering, and then suddenly a colorblind society. It's imperative, I think, for all of us, right, students alike, to know that Black people experience joy, however fleeting, at every point in history. Black joy and Black love, Hoover writes, are central themes for understanding Black history. Simply put, without a focus on Black joy, Black history is incomplete. When we teach oppression and struggle without also teaching the joy of resistance, we miss the mark. So building on Hoover's point, these moments of joy, of love, of happiness must be remembered alongside moments of abject terror and violence. For African Americans in Essex County and this project that we've been working on, we ask this question: what were some of those collective moments of joy among Black people in early Essex County? And I think this very question and subsequent stories that I'll share with you today move Black history beyond a one-dimensional portrayal of suffering to something more human, more holistic, something multidimensional. And so the answer to the question is Black Election Day. And it was an annual West African-influenced community celebration that took place throughout Essex County. Other historians have studied the politics of Black celebrations in the early American Republic, finding that African-descended people forged communities and stood in solidarity with one another. And so Black Election Day is actually not unique to Essex County. We have examples of similar celebrations throughout New England. I found records in New Hampshire and Rhode Island, and also Connecticut. And we also have some examples of a similar celebration in the South and also in the Caribbean. So what's interesting, though, about Essex County is, I think, the story that we can tell about Black joy and civic culture. My intervention here is to shift our perception, to think more about the place of Black girls and women in these early Black cultural celebrations and in this sort of concept of civic culture. And certainly there are historical silences and ellipses. This presentation may raise more questions than it answers, but I still think it's worth engaging and making space for these historical silences in the stories about the Black past. And this is also maybe a call for kind of crowdsourcing. I know a lot of you in this room do research on Essex County, and so you might know of or be familiar with some other sources that I haven't yet found that reveal something about Black Election Day. I want to introduce this concept called rival geography, which was coined by historian Stephanie Camp in her excellent book, Closer to Freedom: Enslaved Women and Everyday Resistance in the Plantation South. And in this book, Camp argues that enslaved people in the antebellum South created a rival geography. In her words, that was an alternative way of knowing and using space that conflicted with enslavers' ideals and demands. They created essentially a world unto themselves, right? Other spaces that gave them room and time for their families, rest from work, or just for amusement. I find that something like a rival geography existed here in Essex County. And while there are very important differences between 18th century Essex County and the antebellum South, I find that free and enslaved Africans in 18th century Essex County developed different ways of using space and establishing place. And this is evident in the stories connected to Black Election Day, which I will talk about now. So the first known recorded reference to Black Election Day is from Benjamin Lind, who is a white lawyer from Salem. And he wrote in his diary on Wednesday, May 27th, 1741, "Fair weather, election, Negroes' holiday here at Salem." And we know a little bit more about what this celebration looked like because about 25 years later, white residents, some of whom were enslavers, actually submitted a petition to the town of Salem criticizing the festival. These petitioners ask the town of Salem to, quote, regulate what they deem to be a great disorder of Negroes assembling together. All right, that's text from the petition. This petition suggests a few things. First, that Black Election Day was probably an annual celebration among enslaved and free Black people in Salem from 1741 to 1768, right? There would be no need to regulate a great disorder if it only happened a couple of times, right? So it probably happened annually. And two, given the date of the petition, which is May 5th, 1768, these petitioners were probably trying to restrict the planned festivities, right, for this celebration. And it's not clear to me exactly what the town decided. That's more research that I have to do in those unprocessed collections at the city of Salem. But while these enslavers regarded this celebration as a great disorder, Black people saw it as a holiday. They celebrated in grand fashion, beating their drums, firing guns, carrying swords, dancing, and shouting. Black people also voted for their own elected official, often referred to as either a king or a governor, who rode through the town on horseback wearing a crown. So more than an imitation of white elections, Black Election Day was an ode to a West African past and an expression of Black joy amid the horrors of enslavement. And this is where we get into this idea of a rival geography, right? This is a rival Black election that became an alternative way to exercise civic duty. King Pompey was one such elected leader. Sometimes the elected Black officials, right, on Election Day claimed royal African ancestry, and that was the case for King Pompey, hence his name. He was from Lynn, and according to one newspaper article, enslaved and free Blacks from Lynn, from Salem, and even from Boston obtained leave from their masters for one day to visit King Pompey. Pompey had been enslaved by the Mansfield family of Lynn. Daniel Mansfield was also one of the owners of the old ironworks. This is some of the research that Emily Murphy has done at Saugus Ironworks. And then in 1757, Mansfield manumitted Pompey. Pompey then married a woman named Phyllis and purchased property. And you can see the deed here in the PowerPoint. So it's about 2 acres of land purchased for about 10 pounds in 1762. This land was situated in Lynn, close to Vinegar Hill on the Saugus River. And on that land, Pompey built a stone house where he lived with Phyllis. And it seems that he and Phyllis welcomed Black people from neighboring towns to this property on Election Day. So one of the questions that I had was, what did Black Election Day mean to children, right, to Black children? And the inner thoughts and reflections of Black children, and really adults too, remains elusive, save for a few sentences that William Bentley wrote in his diary. And William Bentley was a white minister, and he has I think the diary is 4 volumes, is always commenting on what's going on around him. And on June 3rd, 1817, so here we see Election Day continuing through the Revolutionary era, through the early national period, right? So 1817, he reflects in his diary, he talks about a small Black girl in his home who's, quote, too restless to be of any use, as she prepared to attend Black Election Day festivities. And here we can speculate and maybe think and feel with this black girl, the supposed restlessness, right, in her body. The Bentley home couldn't and didn't contain her for these few days. And she was just filled to the brim with excitement. And so I'm thinking, what excited her? Is it the community, the moment of escape away from the Bentley household? Maybe the fun that would come with being around other children and potentially other black women? Because as Bentley wrote in his diary, he reclaimed this small black girl from extreme ignorance and poverty. What if at Election Day, this small black girl saw her mother, her friends, and her family members, right? It takes on even more significance if we think about this from her perspective. What was especially fascinating to uncover in this research is that Black Election Day celebrations did not only happen in Salem, right, with the beating of the drums and the 1768 petition, or in Lynn with King Pompey, but actually stretched throughout Essex County during this period, from 1741 to 1831. Further research revealed 3 more sites: Marblehead, Newburyport, not far from here, and Danvers. So I'll talk about those 3 and what I've been able to find so far. So one site here is Marblehead, and according to one observer reflecting, back, recalling Election Day, the place par excellence in which to keep election, and that was the phrase, to keep election, was at Black Joe's Tavern on Gingerbread Hill in Marblehead. And this structure, this home, is a private residence. It still exists today. In Marblehead, Election Day was really election week, with fun and frolic beginning with Monday morning and ending with the sunset on Saturday night. Black Joe's Tavern was run by the husband and wife team of Joseph Brown and Lucretia Brown. Born around 1773 in Salem, Lucretia Brown appears to have been free, although it is suggested that her parents had been enslaved. In 1794, she married Joseph Brown, who's an Afro-Indigenous man who had served in the Revolutionary War. It's great to remember him, too, on this day, Indigenous Peoples Day. She and Joseph lived in a salt box-style house that he had purchased in 1793, and that's where they ran their tavern. So on Election Day, usually celebrated on a Wednesday, Lucretia, or Aunt Creasy as she was called, welcomed both blacks and whites to the tavern. She whipped up a storehouse of food and drink, from cakes and cookies to beer, and she's thought to have invented the recipe for Joe Frogger's cookies. So if you get up to Marblehead, you can go to some of the local bakeries and get a taste of those. Election week, and particularly the celebration at Black Joe's Tavern, attracted white youth as well. So recalling the festivities decades later, one anonymous writer for the Marblehead Messenger described the week as, quote, the vacation we most longed for. At the tavern, he, then a boy, reported seeing a motley crowd of men and women jumping up and down and running around the room. In the center of the room, in a large armchair, was seated Black Joe, who is about 6 feet in height, with a face beaming with mirth. Black Joe entertained the crowd by playing his fiddle. It was here that Black Joe and Aunt Creasy were crowned king and queen by Black Marblehead residents. So it's one of the early examples that I have that during Election Day, when this voting took place by enslaved and free Africans, that there may have been a vote for a queen, right? And here I want to acknowledge the work of Lauren McCormick, who was executive director at Marblehead Museum, for sharing these newspaper clippings with me, right, recalling Election Day. In 1834, Joseph died, and Lucretia successfully petitioned for his property to be conferred to her. And then she was later able to collect a military widow's pension, right, because Joseph was a Revolutionary War veteran. Lucretia worked as a baker. She's said to have had the best wedding cakes around, right, throughout Essex County. If you wanted a good wedding cake, you went to her. She raised her adopted daughter, Lucy, and apparently continued to lead Election Day celebrations after 1831. And this 1831 date is interesting because that's when the actual election, right, the opening session of the General Court of Massachusetts was abolished, and Election Day was moved to the first Wednesday in January. And I can say more about some reasons for this shift in the calendar, but there was some talk that these celebrations were kind of raucous, kind of out of control, and so maybe shifting the date was to tamp down on some of that. And I also think it suggests there was an interest in tamping down on that because you did have whites and blacks celebrating together. When Lucretia died on May 21st, 1857 in Marblehead, she was described here in her obituary as a well-known, highly esteemed, and respectable colored lady who was eminently industrious and useful member of society. So I think such high praise demonstrates what Lucretia Brown meant to the Marblehead community. In the first few decades of the 19th century, Newburyport's Guinea neighborhood, that was the name, of course, given to the neighborhood. It's not clear to me that black residents called their neighborhood Guinea. They hosted their own Election Day celebrations. In 1893, the Newburyport Daily News published a short article written by George Parsons, who was then a resident of Salem. And he was really feeling nostalgic, right, in the way that he was remembering Black Election Day with great zest and pleasure. He said it couldn't compare to a trip to the World's Fair at that point, which is interesting because the World's Fair was very popular, right, in the late 19th century. So he said Black Election Day was even better than that. He remembered the names of Black residents, which he wrote about in this article. And you can see maybe some of their names up here. And so to me, that suggests that he, as a young boy, because given the time that he's writing the article, he must have been only about 15, right, when he was attending these celebrations. It means that he probably frequented them more than once, right, throughout the 1820s. A Black resident by the name of Old Tracy sold election cake and ale. Caesar was either crowned or regarded as a native African prince. Charlie Jackson played the fiddle, and this was a wonderful moment of music and dancing. And as Parsons noted in the article, this is when the color line was not so strictly drawn, right? So you see a little bit of that interracial interaction that's happening at Black Election Day. And this map is just showing the area of the Guinea neighborhood. If you've been to Newburyport, it's sort of this area off of Auburn Street, which are now, of course, the site of million-dollar homes. But then that was the area, the Guinea neighborhood, where Black residents lived. And I did find when I was looking through census records that it was an area where Black residents lived, but there were also a couple of Irish families that lived there as well. And Election Week was celebrated in Danvers. In fact, it was apparently the leading place for a big time on election. And so you see in a lot of these accounts, there's this boasting, right? That comes up in these town histories. Newburyport's the best place. No, it's Danvers. No, it's Marblehead. I think you see that shows the importance of Election Day and the importance of these celebrations. The Danvers celebration was similar to the one in Newburyport, in Marblehead, and in Lynn. There was music and dancing, there were fiddlers, there was food and drink. And this article here is from the historic collections of Danvers and talks about a husband-wife team, right, who's also providing food and drink and merriment at the Danvers celebration. So all of these recollections about election week invite more questions, many of which the archival record right now doesn't allow us to answer. What little we know about Negro Election Day, however, is significant for a few reasons. One, this Black communal gathering was, by all accounts, a joyous occasion. Enslaved and free Black people were able to claim cultural pride, socialize, and relax, and white people sometimes joined them. It demonstrates the blending of cultures, fusing West African cultural traditions with white colonial practices, right, like election. And we know a little bit about how Black people felt about the week, right, and what it meant to them. It was exciting and thrilling and a fleeting moment of happiness. Black people were able to exercise their civic duty by electing their own leaders. What the sources can't quite capture is the inner thoughts and reflections of Black people themselves, unmediated by white ministers or white lawyers. I think what's vital then is to use what is known about Black Election Day here in Essex County to spotlight Black joy and celebration, and to recognize that Black people built a world unto themselves that most whites failed to perceive in any real way. And I might add that a version of Election Day is still celebrated today. If any of you know Doreen Wade, you know that she is the president of the nonprofit organization Salem United, which hosts the annual Salem Black Picnic. And that's held the third Saturday in July. And that organization is very much tied to this history, right, of Blacks sort of taking up space and celebrating and enjoying themselves. It's necessary, I think, to sit with those horrific moments, right, of trauma. When we talk about Black history, right, when we talk about the slave trade, we talk about enslavement, but that can't be the sum total of the Black experience. We can't just frame Black history as a history of oppression and as a history of enslavement. Certainly, oppression and enslavement severely impacted and continues to impact Black communities. And that's critical to discuss. But we also need to talk about joy and love and the Black experience. And as we continue to trace the history of Black Election Day in Essex County, we must do the work of remembering the presence and contributions of Black women and girls for whom the day or the week meant so much. How did they hold on to those moments of joy, and what did they do? And so by way of conclusion, what some of these sources demonstrate is that African Americans were practicing their love and their joy for West African culture, the making of a new Black civic culture, right, through storytelling and through community builders and community leaders, and being happy, right, even if that was fleeting. What we see in these moments of joy is the full humanity of African Americans as they try to hold on to themselves and their families amid a world that tried to dehumanize them at every turn. And so during the Revolutionary era, perhaps it was these joyful moments and imagining a joyful tomorrow that helped enslaved Africans fight for abolition by running away, by filing freedom petitions, and by claiming their human rights. Thank you.
In the back, yes.
I wonder in your research if you have come across a portion of enslaved Blacks, free Blacks in the congregation
Yes. So the question was about the proportion of enslaved Africans and free Africans during these celebrations. And the answer is I have not been able to get a sense of that. In part because it's not even clear to me the exact number of Africans total who were at these celebrations. So those records are not available right now. I think further digging could possibly turn that up, but it seems to have been a large enough celebration for enslavers in Salem in 1768 to petition, right, the town of Salem because there was so much of a disturbance, they said. So that, I mean, suggests that it was a pretty sizable group.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask what you thought the origin is of the use of the term Guinea to refer sort of generically to
So the question, did you, oh, go ahead, you can repeat the question.
No, it's okay.
But, so the question was about the origins and the use of the word Guinea that you referenced in Newburyport.
Right. So as I was looking through the Newburyport Daily News, it's a reference to where Newburyport white residents believe that enslaved Africans came from, right? That's the reference. I don't know, as I said, that enslaved Africans or free Africans, especially by the mid-19th century, called their own neighborhood that. But there are references throughout the newspaper to Guinea. There are also sort of, you know, there's a question about whether this terminology is sort of derisive, but I think that in Salem, there's an area called Roast Meat Hill, right? There's all these terms. I think Salem also had a Guinea neighborhood. So it seems to, in some ways, be a catch-all, and I don't know that it's totally accurate about the origins of enslaved people.
We had a question in the back.
Can you say more about what we know about the West African
Yes. So when we're thinking about this petition here, if I can bring it up. So what's interesting about this petition is that the way in which these enslavers are describing what they've observed, the drums, that's part of the West African cultural tradition that is sort of carried over to North America. And that's partly why when we're thinking about Election Day, there are these other celebrations in different parts of North America. And that's why that we think that there's a connection between them, because they're using drums, or they're firing guns, or they have swords and that kind of thing. So those are West African cultural practices. We see that in the Caribbean.
We have a question.
I have an online question to relate to you. Do you think the Confederate POW camp in Salisbury during and after the Civil War brought fully racist attitudes that pushed out our Black community in Newburyport? And aside, thank you, I love your talks.
Thanks. That's a great question. So I was trying to trace, and still am trying to trace, the history of African Americans in Newburyport. I'm working with a couple of wonderful organizers and trying to put up a marker to the Black community, right, to Guinea. As someone who lives in Newburyport, is very surprised that there was a sizable Black community there in the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century. I'm not entirely sure what happened to that community. It's a very small one. I probably increased it by 2 or 3% just with my presence there. So I wanted to learn more about it. I don't, at least from the newspaper records in the 19th century, my thinking is that there definitely was, like the Civil War, there were issues where African Americans were looking for employment and moved to bigger cities for that. They moved to Lynn, they moved to Haverhill, they moved to Boston. In the early 20th century, there was sort of like this, more Black people came, so this migration from Virginia, and it seems by the 1920s, 1930s, that community dwindled again. And I don't know why. So we're trying to figure out how to understand these waves of African Americans in Newburyport and why they're sort of either pushed out of the city or why they leave.
We have a question here. Okay.
Do you know how widespread the observance
Right, so in Massachusetts, it was pretty, oh, I'm sorry, yes. How widespread was this celebration? And it seemed to be very widespread. So election week was something that was very important to residents, right, citizens of Massachusetts in the 18th century. So schoolboys, especially in the 19th century, had the week off. And so that's why we see white children, white adults also participating in Election Day festivities. So it's not terribly unique to Black people. What it seems to me is that Black people take over the celebration or infuse their own cultural practices with the celebration, and that then invites or welcomes white residents who want to participate as well. So it was absolutely a holiday. And one wonders why, and kind of what happened to it, and if we want another Election Day holiday, right, to make sure more people can vote.
I got time for one more question in the back.
What's the origin of the Hallow Day? How does that happen?
So the question is, what is the origin of the Hallow Day?
So I think that is just a writing of holiday by Lind in 1741.
Okay, folks. Dr. Baumgartner, thank you again. That was